Hello, everyone. Well, back in the new year, and you think I'd be rested and chilled and relaxed, but no, I'm grumpy. I'm more grumpy than ever, in fact. And I'm so grumpy about this particular topic. I'm not just doing one presentation, I'm going to bore you with 3 different presentations. But as someone who's practiced natural therapies, and particularly herbal therapies, all my life, and is often described either directly or indirectly in the media and elsewhere as having an illegitimate role in healthcare, it makes me furious when I see all these people who would otherwise criticize natural therapies just drink that drug company Kool-Aid. So that's what I'm going to grump about now for three more presentations, counting this one. So my target in this presentation is the new Alzheimer antibody drugs. In part 2, I'm going to look at these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are used for depression. And in part 3, I'm going to look at 2 very problematical drugs that are still widely used, the benzodiazepines and pregabalin. So let's start with these wonderful, what are they? Alzheimer antibody drugs. So what am I talking about? These are antibodies, so they're like immune antibodies. They're big proteins, and you get injected or infuse them into your bloodstream, and they're meant to then go and cross the blood-brain barrier and dissolve plaque in your brain, because Alzheimer's disease has been linked to the accumulation of this amyloid beta plaque in the brain. So the theory that many drug companies have been operating on in their research, and they've spent billions and billions on this topic, is to come up with drugs that can dissolve this plaque, and hey presto, you no longer have Alzheimer's disease and you're back being a person with normal cognition. So there are 3 drugs that are attracting, the media attention at the moment, both medical media and mainstream media. The first is aducanumab, that was approved by the FDA in 2021 and presumably is rolling out in other countries. Then there's lecanemab, that was approved by the FDA last year. And finally, there's the one causing the biggest fuss of all, which is donanemab, which hasn't yet been approved, but is pending probably sometime early in 2024. And here's an example of the interest and the trumpeting that's happening in the mainstream media. In this case, it's from the Australian ABC, and it's talking about the drug donanemab. And it says, new class of Alzheimer's drug shows promise in patients in early stages of disease. And for decades, scientists and families have been frustrated by the intractable nature of Alzheimer's disease. But donanemab can slow disease progression by 35%. And geriatrician Michael Woodward says the medical community is excited by the results. So slowing progression by 35%. Medical community is excited. Should we be excited? And here's another quote from that, is we now have 3 drugs that have been shown that they can critically slow down the decline. And that is donanemab and the other 2 that I presented to you in the earlier slide. And those in the study were all at the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease and aged between 60 and 85. And here's another one from the BBC, drug donanemab seen as a turning point in dementia fight. After global trial confirms it slows cognitive decline. The antibody medicine helps in the early stages of the disease by clearing a protein that builds up in the brains of people with this type of dementia. And then the Independent, for example, calls donanemab a breakthrough Alzheimer's drug. Even the highly educated and critical scientists of Harvard are getting in on the act, talking about the start of a new era for Alzheimer's treatment. And in this context, it's lecanemab they're talking about and why it appears to offer hope for those with this deadly disease. And here's an recent editorial from the Journal of the American Medical Association Neurology that talks about the era of disease-modifying treatment that we're now in with these monoclonal antibodies against amyloid beta. So what's particularly causing, as I mentioned, the big interest, the high level of interest in the exaggerated and extraordinary statements in the press, is this donanemab trial. But interestingly, if we look at Medscape's coverage of this trial, the Trailblazer ALZ 2 trial, they point out that safety issues linger as details of 3 deaths emerge. So finally, we're seeing a little bit of balance in the media coverage. And this is the key paper to which they're referring to, published in JAMA, as you can see, in August 2023. And it was a fairly large trial, 860 received donanemab, and 876 received placebo. It was given intravenously every 4 weeks for 72 weeks. So almost a year and a half. But let's have a reality check. Let's stop drinking that drug company Koolaid. Here's an interesting example that Pfizer has a highly successful recently drug company, as you're aware, has stopped its research for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's drugs. And the reason they are giving, is complex and what have you, but basically it's too hard and there's not enough money in it. There have been many, many failed trials of these Alzheimer antibody drugs. Why would that be the case? Well, firstly, it's debated whether plaque is just a bystander effect, or if it's a significant or just a marker of disease activity, or it is a significant contributor to the pathology. And that debate is still happening. And there's credible evidence on both sides, I might say. I don't necessarily fall in one camp or the other. But here's the point, that when you want to dissolve plaque, and particularly if you're using an antibody, well, what are antibodies? They're things that are used by the immune system. So if you're going in to destroy a particular part of tissue with an antibody, you're going to generate inflammation. And if you've got someone with advanced Alzheimer's disease and you give them these drugs, the inflammation it generates can cause significant negative health effects, including on their cognition. They actually get cognitively worse as a result of the attempt to dissolve their plaque. And so many of these drugs have failed and led to companies like Pfizer just pulling out of that area of research altogether. So those drug companies that have persisted have realized they need to change the game. So what they're now doing is they're doing, as per the donanemab trial, they're doing research in the early stages of disease before there's too much plaque and before too much inflammation gets generated in the brain. But as we've already heard, even then, 3 people died from being given the drug, probably because of that inflammation. And really, when it comes to Alzheimer drugs, we need a serious reality check. And fortunately, from two leading figures in the field of evidence-based medicine, Adrian Fugberman and Susan Mulcan, we saw this published in an editorial in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2023. And they provided a review or viewpoint review / editorial along the theme, are the new Alzheimer drugs better than older drugs? And they point out that their review provides convincing arguments in support that the conclusion that the newer Alzheimer disease drugs, these 3 antibody plaque-dissolving drugs, are not meaningfully better than the older Alzheimer disease drugs, and reasonably convincing arguments that neither class of drugs provides any clinically meaningful benefits in the majority of patients. So let's look at the detail of what they say. So we're talking about their approval of lecanemab, aducanumab. By the way, aducanumab was approved, as I said, in 2021. And the approval of aducanumab, the first of these types of drugs, was so controversial that a number of people on the committee, on the FDA committee that approved it, resigned. And the general consensus of opinion is that the evidence supporting aducanumab, despite its approval, is not convincing. If we look at the second one, lecanemab, in this review, the authors describe that, yes, it did show a 27% slower cognitive decline compared to the placebo on a particular scale over 18 months, but this improvement wasn't clinically significant. For example, the cholinesterase inhibitors like donepezil, the first drugs for Alzheimer's disease, had similar effect sizes in earlier trials. And stated another way, neither the lecanemab trial nor the donepezil trials found clinically significant beneficial effects. I've certainly never seen donepezil do anything much long-term, maybe some short-term benefits, but nothing long-term for my Alzheimer patients. And the first two that were approved, or that are only approved at this stage, lecanemab and aducanumab, have been associated with brain edema and brain hemorrhage. And another review suggested that these drugs may accelerate brain atrophy and ventricular enlargement, which is exactly what you don't want in Alzheimer's disease. So what about donanemab? Is it the game changer? Well, let's look at this trial. It was very effective at eliminating its target, which was the cerebral amyloid plaque. And at the end of 76 weeks, amyloid plaques were cleared in 80% of the treatment group. So that's a good outcome. But the clinical effect was comparatively weak. So they talk about decline, 35% decline in progression. But what that actually translates to is a delayed progression of only 4 months. Only 4 months. So yeah, 35% delayed progression, but that means you get another 4 months of feeling normal and then the disease kicks in. And similarly to the other trials, it didn't provide sufficient evidence of safety or efficacy in various ethnic groups. It's because this was a US study, it's highlighting those US ethnic groups. And indeed, there's some suggestion that the effects were quite negative in certain ethnic groups. And above all, treatment with donanemab was associated with significant safety risks, including the 3 deaths that were determined to be drug-related. And in the treatment group, amyloid-related imaging abnormalities was seen in about 37% versus 15% in the placebo group. Put in a basic, straightforward, blunt way, the drug damaged the brains of 22% of the people who took it. And as part of this, microhemorrhage occurred in 26.8% in the donanemab group versus 12.5% in the placebo group. And this reviewer, donanemab for Alzheimer's disease, who benefits and who is harmed, this Dieters and Manley, say clinicians and the public will need to weigh the potential benefit of treatment, which is delay of progression of only 4 months on average, with the financial and quality of life costs of infusions. This is likely to cost at least $100,000 a year to the person or the government if it's government supported. You've got to go in every month for an infusion. You've got to have MRI monitoring. You're going to risk brain damage, and you're going to risk death for 4 months. If that's a breakthrough, then only if you're drinking the drug company Kool-Aid. Given the strict clinical and biomarker criteria applied for patient selection in the trial and what will happen clinically, they can at present be considered, these drugs, only relevant for a subset of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And the current results suggest, this is the early stages, that even within this subset, patients with a high tau burden, that's another aspect of Alzheimer's pathology, may not benefit. So it's not meaningful. As I said, if this is a breakthrough, we're drinking the drug company Kool-Aid. And they go on to say, from a more practical standpoint, the modest benefits would likely not be questioned by patients or clinicians or payers if amyloid antibodies were low risk, inexpensive, and simple to administer. However, they are none of these. So let's stop drinking that drug company Kool-Aid and let's look at herbs. So if none of the drugs work, if the drugs might kill you or damage your brain or cost you $100,000 a year, what about using something simple like the herb ginkgo biloba? And you may say, it's just a herb, there's no evidence. Well, there is significant evidence. In fact, an Asian clinical expert group on neurocognitive disorders, and I'm talking here about top-level clinicians, psychologists, gerontologists, and what have you. This was no lightweight group, concluded that based on the available evidence for ginkgo extract, and it was class 1 level A evidence, that it is best practice for treatment as follows: for Alzheimer's disease in conjunction with the current drugs like donepezil and memantine, also for vascular dementia. And this is important because these antibody-dissolving drugs are only aimed at an Alzheimer type pathology. The majority of people who have dementia have a mixed pathology between Alzheimer type dementia changes and vascular dementia changes. And ginkgo's in there for both. And even for mild cognitive impairment, there's some evidence. MCI is mild cognitive impairment. VAD is vascular dementia. They also stress it's important to allow sufficient time for the effects of ginkgo to become evident. And it can be safely used as an add-on agent, as I have done with standard anti-dementia drugs. But you must give enough dose. So that's of the specialized extract, 240 milligrams a day. It's a 50-to-1 extract. So that's 12 grams of ginkgo leaf a day. And that has a similar efficacy to all current drugs. So if all current drugs don't work, that might mean it doesn't work, but at least you're giving something safe. And believe me, I've used it and it does work. It does help. There's no magic bullet for dementia and Alzheimer's disease, but ginkgo helps just as well or better than any of the drugs I see available. And that includes my reading of the data for donanemab. So why is there this incredible bias and ignorance of what's going on in Alzheimer's research? And the answer is because everyone is drinking the drug company Kool-Aid. And just remember, if you're giving a strong antibody to dissolve plaque on a basis of a theory that is still not fully accepted, that you cannot strongly perturb the body's physiology and biochemistry without expecting pushback and or consequences. And who said that? Me. The grumpy old herbalist said that. So thank you for listening to my grump. I'm going back to my spells now.